The moment Marshall Ford rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, he looked like a man the desert had tried to swallow whole and nearly succeeded. His horse, a battered roan gelding with more patience than most men Marshall had ever known, picked its way down the main street with the slow, careful gait of an animal that had walked too many miles in too many directions, and had learned not to expect much at the end of any of them. Dust coated Marshall from the crown of his hat to the cracked leather of his boots, and the hat itself sat low over eyes that had learned to read distances rather than people. He was 31 years old, and he carried those years the way a stone carries the marks of a river, not with pride, but with the quiet evidence of having been worn down and held together at the same time. He had not slept under a roof in 5 years. That fact had ceased to feel remarkable to him, the way certain hungers cease to feel remarkable when you stop expecting them to be satisfied. He had rolled his bedroll out under cottonwoods and under open sky, had pressed his back against sandstone canyon walls when the January wind came screaming down from the north, had curled beneath his saddle blanket in the pounding summer rain of the Indian Territory, and told himself that a man who expected comfort was a man who had not yet understood the nature of things. He had drifted from cattle drives to fencing disputes to the odd stint of work for a rancher who needed a hand and asked no questions. He had never stayed anywhere long enough to matter. Caldwell was a border town, sitting right at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, and in 1882 it still hummed with the electric nervousness of a place that could not quite decide whether it was civilized or not. Cattle had come through in great rivers of hooves and dust all summer, headed north along the Kishom Trail, and now that the drives were winding down for the season, the town had the slightly deflated feeling of a fair after the last wagon had gone. The saloons were quieter than they had been in July. The livery smelled of old straw and horse sweat, and the particular sweetness of hay going slowly to dust. Marshall tied his horse at the rail in front of the livery and stood for a moment in the street, letting his legs remember what flat ground felt like. A cold October wind moved through, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something that might have been pie. He turned his face into it like a man tasting water after a long dry spell, then squared his shoulders and went looking for something to eat. The place he found was not the saloon, though the saloon was where every instinct pointed him. It was a smaller establishment 2 doors down from the post office, with a hand-lettered sign above the door that read Brenner's Cookhouse, MEALS 10 cents board BY arrangement. The window had been cleaned recently enough that he could see the warm glow of lamplight through it, and through that same window he could see the shapes of 3 men sitting at a table, bent over their plates with the concentrated attention of men who had not eaten all day. He pushed through the door. The heat of the place hit him first, the good heat of a working kitchen that had been going since before daylight. Then the smell: salt pork, dried apple in some kind of pastry, coffee so strong it was practically a solid object. Then, behind the long counter that ran along the back wall, he saw Ruby Brenner. She was 26 years old, and she moved like someone who had never had the luxury of moving slowly. A dark apron over a blue calico dress, her brown hair pinned up in a practical knot that was losing the battle at her temples, where curling strands had escaped and hung around a face that was flushed from the heat of the stove. She was carrying 2 plates at once with the particular ease of a woman who had been carrying plates since she was old enough to reach a table, and she set them down in front of 2 men at the far end without spilling so much as a drop of the gravy. Then she turned and saw Marshall standing in the doorway. She did not startle. He noticed that. She looked at him with dark eyes that had clearly seen every variety of rough-edged man that the Kishom Trail could produce, looked him over with the quick efficiency of a woman assessing a situation, and then she said, "You eating or just standing there letting the cold in?" "Eating," Marshall said. "Sit down then. You want coffee?" "Yes, ma'am. It's 10 cents for a meal. Salt pork, biscuits, and whatever's in the pot, which tonight is bean soup. Pie if you want it." "All of it," Marshall said. Something shifted briefly in her expression, not quite pity, but recognition of some kind, the way a person who has been hungry recognizes hunger in another face. And then she was already moving back to the kitchen, and he was left to find himself a seat at the long table nearest the window. He ate with the slow, thorough attention of a man who understood that this meal might need to last him a while. The biscuits were good. The bean soup was better than good, seasoned with something he could not identify, black pepper and something smoky. And it had that particular depth of flavor that came from a pot that had been given real time and real attention. He ate all of it and sopped the bowl with the last of the biscuit, and then the pie arrived, dried apple and cinnamon in a crust that shattered exactly as it should, and he ate that too. When he pushed the plate back, Ruby Brenner was standing at the counter, tallying something in a ledger with a short pencil, and she did not look up when she asked, "Where are you heading?" "Nowhere particular," Marshall said. Now she looked up. "Coming from lots of places." She studied him for a moment, and he had the sense of being read rather than merely observed, that she was not looking at the dust or the worn clothes or the pistol at his hip, but at something underneath those things, something she was trying to determine the nature of. Then she said, "You know anything about cattle?" "Enough. Horses. Considerably more than that." She put down her pencil. "I've got a small spread north of town, 8 miles out. My husband passed 3 years ago, and I've been managing it with my hired man, Pete Carver. But Pete broke his wrist last month, and he can't do the heavy work until spring. I need someone who can mend fence, tend stock, and do what needs doing. It's room and board and $1.50 a week." Marshall looked at her steadily. "What kind of stock?" 12 head of cattle, 4 horses, pigs, chickens, a mule named General Grant who bites." "I've known worse mules," Marshall said. She almost smiled. "The work is hard, and I'm not an easy employer. I expect what I ask for, and I ask for a full day's work. The hired man's room is out behind the house. It's a bunk in a shed." "I'll take it," Marshall said. Ruby Brenner looked at him for another long moment, the kind of assessment that was final rather than preliminary. "You have a name." "Marshall Ford." "Ruby Brenner," she said, and extended her hand across the counter the way a man would, and he took it, and her grip was firm and brief and entirely businesslike. "I'm here until 6. If you want the work, you can ride out with me when I close up." He paid his 10 cents and went back out into the October cold to see to his horse. He did not fully understand. Standing there in the dying light of that October afternoon with his hands in his pockets, and the wind pushing the smell of the prairie through the street, why he had said yes so quickly. He had been offered work before and had turned it down for reasons that had made complete sense at the time: too close to people, too many questions, too much of the particular weight that came from being expected somewhere every day. But something about the directness of that woman, the way she had looked at him like she was capable of seeing through to the arithmetic of him, had made him feel, for the first time in a very long while, that saying yes was the honest thing to do. He waited. At 6 o'clock, Ruby Brenner came out of the cookhouse with a shawl over her shoulders and a basket over one arm, locked the door behind her with a key she wore on a cord at her wrist, and climbed up onto a wagon seat with the matter-of-fact ease of a woman who had been doing it unassisted for years. She looked down at Marshall, still standing at the hitching rail with his horse. "You remember how to follow a wagon?" she asked. "I'll manage," he said. She clicked her tongue at the pair of drafts in the traces, and the wagon moved off, and Marshall swung up onto his roan and followed her north out of Caldwell into the enormous darkening sky of the Kansas plain. They did not talk during those 8 miles. The road was not much of a road, just a track through the grass that the wagon wheels had established through repeated use, and the moon was coming up large and pale over the eastern horizon, washing the prairie in a cold silver light that made everything look both very beautiful and very remote. Marshall rode alongside the wagon rather than behind it, keeping pace with the drafts, and Ruby drove with both hands on the reins and her eyes on the track ahead, and the silence between them was not unfriendly. It was the silence of two people who had both learned, through necessity, that most things that needed saying could wait. The ranch came into view as a cluster of darkness against the lighter darkness of the sky, the squat shape of the house, the taller line of the barn, the broken geometry of the fence lines running out from the yard. A dog barked once from somewhere inside the barn and then stopped. Ruby pulled the wagon up in front of the house and climbed down before Marshall could think to offer any assistance, which was clearly the correct approach, because she moved with such absolute certainty about where her feet were going to land that any help would have been more interference than aid. "Barn's there," she said, nodding toward it. "Put your horse up for the night. Stall's clean, hay's in the loft. There's oats in the bin. I'll leave the lamp burning in the kitchen window while I get the house open." Marshall put his horse up in the barn, rubbing the roan down with slow, thorough attention, checking his feet, making sure he had water and hay. The barn had been well maintained, the stalls were solid, the roof had no holes he could see, and the smell of it was the good, honest smell of animals well cared for. One of the 4 horses, a young bay mare, put her nose over her stall door and regarded him with calm brown eyes, and he held the back of his hand to her nose until she decided he was acceptable. When he came out of the barn, the lamp was indeed burning in the kitchen window, painting a warm square of yellow light in the dark. He walked around the side of the house to where she had described the hired man's quarters. It was a low shed attached to the back of the house by a roofed walkway, and inside it was simple in the way of things that were simple because they had to be rather than by design: a narrow bunk against one wall, a small iron stove with a stack of wood beside it, a single shelf above the bunk, a hook on the back of the door. A folded blanket sat at the foot of the bunk. Marshall stood in the doorway of that little room for a long moment. The bunk was not much. The roof was low, and it needed some attention at the far corner where the wood had gone dark with old weather. The single window was small and faced west, but it was a roof. It was 4 walls. There was a stove and wood to burn in it, and a blanket on a bunk, and the sound of the wind outside was, for the first time in 5 years, the sound of the wind on the outside of something he was on the inside of. He sat down on the edge of the bunk and put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor. He had not slept under a roof in 5 years, and he had told himself that it did not matter, that a man who needed 4 walls and a ceiling was a man who had made himself too dependent on comforts that the world was not obligated to provide. He had told himself that he preferred the open sky, that it suited him, that the distances of the plains were company enough. He had been telling himself these things for so long that he had mistaken the telling for the truth. He lit the stove with the matches on the shelf, rolled his bedroll out on the bunk, pulled off his boots, and lay down on his back listening to the stove begin to tick and pop as it warmed, and the wind move around the eaves, and somewhere in the house proper, the muffled sound of Ruby Brenner moving through her rooms, putting things away, banking her own fire for the night. These were ordinary sounds, domestic and unhurried, the sounds of a life being lived at its own natural pace, and Marshall Ford listened to them until they stopped, and then he listened to the silence that came after, and then, for the first time in a very long time, he slept. He was up before dawn. It was a habit too deep in him to need intention. He simply opened his eyes in the gray pre-dawn dark and was already moving, pulling on his boots, splashing water from the pitcher on the shelf over his face and neck, running wet hands through his hair. He built the stove up against the morning cold and then went out to the barn. He had the horses fed, watered, and the barn swept out by the time Ruby Brenner appeared in the barn door with a lantern and a look of moderate surprise. "You're early," she said. "Habit," Marshall said. She studied the barn with the critical eye of someone who knew every corner of it. Then she made a small sound that was not quite approval but was in the neighborhood of it. "Pete usually sleeps until 7, she said. "I'll try to moderate myself," Marshall said dryly. Something moved in her face that was close to amusement, and then she said, "Coffee's on. Come to the kitchen when you're done here." He was done in 10 minutes, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table while she poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set a plate of cornbread between them. The kitchen was clean and ordered, every surface doing exactly the job it was meant to do, and through the window the Kansas dawn was arriving in long bands of orange and red above the flat horizon. Ruby sat down across from him with her own cup and pulled a scrap of paper toward her from beside the stove. "Fence on the north pasture needs mending before winter," she said, reading from what appeared to be a list. "3 sections at least. Then the roof on the pig shed needs patching before the first snow. General Grant needs his back left shoe looked at. Elias Hammond at the smithy in town said he'd come out this week. And the cattle need moving from the east grazing to the winter pasture closer to the barn." "I can start with the fence," Marshall said. "I'll show you where the wire and the post maul are kept." She looked up from the list. "You eaten enough? There's more cornbread." "I'm fine," he said. A pause. The coffee was strong and good. Outside, a rooster had made his opinions known about the dawn. "How long have you been working cattle country?" Ruby asked. It was not quite the question she wanted to ask, he could tell, but it was the question she had decided was within bounds. "About 8 years on and off," Marshall said. "Drove cattle up from Texas twice. Worked horses for a horse breeder in New Mexico territory for a year. Miscellaneous ranching work between. Family. Mother passed when I was 14, father before that." He said it without any particular weight, as facts rather than wounds. "No brothers or sisters." Ruby looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it, but she did not belabor it, which he appreciated. "And you?" he said. "I came here from Missouri with my husband Daniel in 1877. He had notions about cattle ranching. He had good notions and he worked hard and he was a good man. Fever took him in the winter of 1879. She said this the same way he had said his own history, as fact, as something that had happened and had shaped things but was not being asked to perform as grief. "We had a son. He died with Daniel. He was 2 years old." Marshall said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for that." "It was a hard winter," Ruby said simply. She put down her coffee cup and stood. "The post maul and wire are in the lean-to on the west side of the barn. There's a 1-horse cart you can use to haul supplies out to the north pasture. I'll be at the cookhouse until 6. Pete will be out to give you any directions you need. He can't work, but his tongue's still in good order." And she was gone, back into the house to collect her things for the ride into town. And Marshall sat for another moment in the warm kitchen with the smell of cornbread and wood smoke and coffee. And then he went to find the post maul. Pete Carver turned out to be a wiry man in his late 40s with a walrus mustache, and a broken wrist wrapped in a splint that he held against his chest with the aggrieved dignity of a man who had sustained an injury he considered beneath his dignity. He came out of the bunk room he kept in the main barn around 7:30 and found Marshall already loading fence wire onto the cart. "She hired you last night?" Pete asked, eyeing him with the frank assessment of a man evaluating a replacement. "Yesterday evening," Marshall confirmed. "You know fence work?" "Well enough." Pete walked around the cart, inspecting the load, making small adjustments with his good hand. "North pasture's got 3 sections where the posts have rotted through at the ground. After the last cattle drive came through, idiots cut through our property rather than going around. The middle section got pushed flat by about 400 head. Going to take a full day just for that stretch." "I'll start with the worst of it," Marshall said. Pete studied him for another moment, apparently satisfied with what he found. "You hungry? There's leftover beans from last night in the pot on the stove." "Had cornbread with the coffee," Marshall said. "She made you cornbread first morning. She left it on the table." Pete made a small sound that Marshall could not interpret and then walked back toward the barn, talking about the fence line over his shoulder. And Marshall listened to everything the man said and filed it carefully. The north pasture was about a half-mile from the house, and the fence work was exactly as described, and then some. The worst section had not just been pushed flat, but had been tangled into a mass of wire and broken posts that would have to be pulled up and entirely restrung. Marshall worked through the morning with the steady, concentrated attention of a man who had done enough physical labor to understand that there was no point in working faster than you could work accurately. He pulled posts, set new ones with the maul, strung wire with the pliers that had been in the cart, and by noon had gotten the worst section back to something that would hold cattle. He ate his midday meal alone, sitting on the back of the cart with a biscuit and a piece of cold salt pork that Pete had wrapped in cloth and sent with him, and he looked out across the Kansas plain and felt, without quite having a name for it, that something in the texture of his days had shifted. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself with the natural inevitability of things that fit together the way they are meant to. Marshall worked from before dawn until the light failed. He mended fence. He patched the pig shed roof and replaced 2 boards in the barn floor that had gotten soft. He moved the cattle from the east grazing to the winter pasture with the help of Pete, who could ride perfectly well with a broken wrist, and who sat his horse like a man grown from a saddle, directing the operation from above while Marshall and the dog did the actual work. He negotiated a careful relationship with General Grant, the mule, which involved never approaching from the left side and always having a carrot somewhere on his person. He watched Ruby Brenner. He did this with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, and he told himself he was doing it because understanding how a ranch operated required understanding the person who ran it, which was true enough as far as it went. She came home from the cookhouse each evening at 6:15 or 6:30, driving the wagon through whatever weather the Kansas sky had decided to produce, and she came into the kitchen and started the evening meal without pausing and without complaint, even on the evenings when the wind had been ferocious, and she had driven 8 miles into the teeth of it with her shawl pulled tight and her eyes narrow against the blowing dust. She was not a woman who complained. She was not a woman who advertised her difficulties. But she was not closed, either, not the kind of stillness that was really just a wall. In the evenings, when Marshall had come to the kitchen door to report on the day's work, as she had asked him to do so she could keep her own accounting of what had been done and what remained, she asked careful questions and listened to the answers with full attention, and sometimes the reporting turned into something more like conversation, and the conversations lengthened gradually, the way days lengthen coming out of winter slowly, almost imperceptibly, but with gathering warmth. He learned that she had been born in Missouri, the third of 5 children, and that her father had run a dry goods store that had never quite prospered. That she had married Daniel Brenner at 18 and had followed him west with the particular courage of a young woman who was equal parts terrified and determined and would not let either feeling stop her. That she had opened the cookhouse because, after Daniel died, she had done the arithmetic of what she had and what she needed, and had understood that her cooking was an asset she had not been using to its full potential. That she had kept the ranch because she could not bring herself to sell it, because even diminished it was still the thing she and Daniel had built, and some part of her could not give it over to strangers. She learned things about him more slowly, because he gave them less readily. But she was patient and she was perceptive, and she had a quality that Marshall had not often encountered, the capacity to listen to what was not said as well as what was. One evening in early November, when the first real cold had come sweeping down from the north, and the kitchen was the warmest place on the ranch by a considerable margin, she poured 2 cups of coffee after he had given his report and pushed one across the table toward him without asking if he wanted it, in the way of someone who had already determined that he did. "Where were you before Caldwell?" she asked. "Coming up from the territory," Marshall said. "Had a job with a rancher outside of Enid, fence work mostly. And before that," he wrapped his hands around the cup, "Dodge City for a while, before that Colorado. You've moved around a great deal." "Yes," she looked at him. The lamp between them put a warm light on her face, softening the weariness that was always there at the end of her day. "Is there a reason you've stayed in motion?" she asked, and her voice was gentle enough that the question did not feel like an intrusion. Marshall was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. "After my mother passed," he said, I had nobody in any one place that made that place matter more than any other, so I moved. And then I had been moving long enough that I didn't know how to stop. He looked up at her. Something like that. Ruby nodded slowly. I understand something about that, she said. After Daniel and the baby, there were months where it felt like staying in one place meant staying with the grief, and the grief was enormous. If I had been free to move, I might have. She looked at her own hands around her cup. But the ranch kept me here, and then the cookhouse, and then before I knew it, it was my life again instead of just something I was enduring. Did that help? Marshall asked. The staying. Yes, Ruby said, though I wouldn't have believed it at the time. They sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind was making its November voice, a long, searching sound that pressed against the walls and then moved on. The fire popped in the stove. I should let you get to your rest, Marshall said eventually. In a minute, Ruby said, and she refilled both their cups, and they stayed another half-hour in the warm kitchen talking about things that were and were not important, and it was one of the better evenings Marshall Ford could remember. November moved toward December with the deliberate trudge of a Kansas winter approaching. The days got shorter and the cold sharpened, and the work shifted more time in the barn keeping the stock comfortable, more wood to cut and stack, repairs to anything that needed to be tight against the coming snow. Pete's wrist began to mend, and he started doing lighter work, carting hay and checking waterers, and keeping up a running commentary on everything from the current cattle prices to the political situation in Washington, which he had strong opinions about. Marshall had been on the ranch for 6 weeks when the trouble came from the direction he had not been watching. It arrived in the form of a man named Howard Stuckey, who rode up to the house on a Thursday morning while Ruby was in town and demanded to speak with whoever's in charge. Marshall was in the yard splitting wood when the man arrived, and he straightened up from the chopping block and waited. Stuckey was heavyset and prosperous-looking, the kind of man who used his physical size the way other men used money, as a statement of power before any words were exchanged. He had a cattleman's look, the look of someone who measured everything he saw in terms of what it was worth to him. "Where's the widow?" he asked, not getting down from his horse. "Mrs. Brenner is in town," Marshall said. "I have business with her regarding this property," Stuckey said. "I've made her 3 offers in the past 18 months and she's refused all 3. I'm coming out to make a 4th, and this time I expect a different answer. You tell her Howard Stuckey came by." "I'll tell her," Marshall said. "And you might tell her as well that an isolated woman running a property this size without proper help is going to find things getting harder, not easier. The winters out here don't care about a woman's determination." He said it in a way that managed to be both an observation and a threat. Marshall looked at him steadily. "I'll tell her you came by," he said again. Stuckey looked at him for a moment, apparently assessing the quality of the stillness he was encountering, and then he turned his horse and rode back down the track toward town. Marshall went back to splitting wood. When Ruby came home that evening, he told her about the visit as part of his report, without editorial. She listened with her face still and her eyes quiet, and when he was done she said, "Howard Stuckey has wanted this land since before Daniel died. He runs cattle north of here, and this parcel would give him access to the creek water he doesn't have." She stirred the pot on the stove. "He's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer when he believes persistence will eventually do the work for him. He implied that things might get harder for you," Marshall said. Ruby turned from the stove and looked at him. "Yes, he's been implying that for 2 years." She held his gaze. "I'm not selling." "I didn't think you were," Marshall said. Something shifted in her expression. It was not relief exactly, but it was its cousin, the look of a person who had braced for the need to defend a position, and found that no defense was necessary. "I'm not selling," she said again, more quietly this time, more to herself than to him, as though saying it out loud was the thing that made it remain true. "I'll keep a closer eye on the fences and the stock," Marshall said, "in case the kind of pressure he applies is the kind that comes at night." Ruby looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Marshall," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed that. He noticed it the way you notice the first bird of spring, which is to say completely. December came, and the first snow came with it. It arrived on a Tuesday, 3 inches overnight, and Marshall was out at first light to make sure the water troughs hadn't frozen solid and the stock had what they needed. The world was white and silent in the way that only a fresh snowfall can make it, and the tracks he left across the yard were the first marks on a clean page. He worked through the morning feeding and checking everything, and when he came into the kitchen at midday, stomping his boots clean in the doorway, Ruby was at the stove making soup, and the kitchen smelled of onion and sage, and the warmth was extraordinary after the cold outside. "You should eat," she said, not turning from the stove. "Sit down." He sat down. She set a bowl in front of him and then sat across from him with her own bowl, and they ate together, which had become a natural thing over the weeks, the midday meal when she was home, and sometimes the evening meal too, at the kitchen table, with Pete sometimes joining them and sometimes not, depending on whether he had ridden to town and whether he had found the saloon to his satisfaction. "I need to ask you something," Ruby said. "All right," Marshall said. She looked at her soup for a moment and then at him. "Are you planning to stay through winter?" He felt the question land and understood its weight. It was not a simple operational question. It had layers that both of them were aware of. "Yes," he said. "And after winter," he held her gaze. "I haven't thought beyond that," he said, which was the truthful answer. She nodded slowly, as though she had expected something like this but had needed to ask anyway. "The thing is," she said carefully, "Pete is planning to head to his sister's farm in the spring. His wrist hasn't healed as well as the doctor hoped, and he's thinking of getting off horses permanently." She paused. "I'd need someone reliable to stay on, not just for the season." "Is that an offer?" Marshall asked. "It's a question," she said, "about whether staying in a place might be something you could do." He looked at her across the table. This woman who had kept a ranch through grief and weather, and the machinations of Howard Stuckey and 3 Kansas winters alone, who made soup with sage, and who drove 8 miles home in the dark, and who had handed him the first honest wages he had earned in a long time, and never once made him feel that he owed her anything beyond a full day's work. He looked at her, and he thought about what she had said in the kitchen weeks ago about how staying had given her life back. "I could try," he said, and they both understood without saying so that it was not only about the ranch. December deepened. The work in winter was different from the work in fall, slower in some ways, more urgent in others. There was stock to tend twice a day without fail, water to keep from freezing, wood to keep from running short. There were small repairs that could only be done in certain kinds of weather and larger ones that had to wait. There were evenings that came early and lasted long, and the kitchen at the Brenner Ranch became, gradually and naturally, a place that held 2 people rather than 1. They talked about everything. They talked about the cattle market and the coming of the railroads, and whether Caldwell would grow or shrink in the next decade. They talked about Missouri and Texas and the territory and the mountains of Colorado. They talked about books. Ruby had 3. A Bible and a dog-eared copy of a novel called The Pioneers, and a book of poetry that had been Daniel's, and that she had never opened after he died, but that she found herself opening again now in the evenings. She read Marshall a passage one night, something about the permanence of the natural world against the brevity of human things, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his eyes on her face. And when she finished, he said, "That's true," in a quiet voice, and she looked up and found him looking at her rather than at the book. She looked back down at the page, but she did not turn it for a long time. Christmas came with a particular stillness on the land. Ruby closed the cookhouse for the 2 days around the holiday and cooked a meal that was completely impractical for 2 people and completely wonderful. A wild turkey that Marshall had shot and dressed, and that she had roasted with herbs from the dried bunches hanging in the kitchen, and potatoes, and dried cranberries cooked down into something sweet and tart, and a gingerbread cake that she had made from a recipe her mother had sent in a letter 3 years ago that she kept folded in the recipe book. Pete had gone to town for the holiday. He had friends there who kept a standing invitation. And so it was just the two of them at the kitchen table for Christmas dinner, with the snow outside making the world small and the stove making the kitchen warm and the turkey making everything smell extraordinary. "My mother used to make this cake," Ruby said, cutting a slice and putting it on his plate. "She put dried ginger in it, not just the ground kind. You can taste the difference." Marshall tasted it. "You can," he said. Ruby smiled. It was a real smile, not the contained professional expression she wore at the cookhouse, but the fuller thing underneath it, and it changed her face entirely, made it younger and softer and very beautiful, and Marshall felt something in his chest that he recognized belatedly as the particular ache of wanting. "What did your Christmases look like?" she asked. "When you were growing up?" "Small," he said. "My mother made a good effort with very little. There was always something sweet, and she always found something to give me even when there was no money for gifts. One year she gave me a pocket knife she'd gotten from the neighbor in trade for a month of laundering. I still have it." He touched his vest pocket without thinking. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Ruby said. "She was the most capable person I have ever known," Marshall said. "She would have done well out here." Ruby's eyes softened. "Tell me about her." He had not talked about his mother in years. Not because the grief was too raw, it had been 17 years, and grief that old changes into something different, something that is more like a landscape than a wound. But because there had not been anyone who asked with genuine interest, who wanted to know rather than to fill a silence. He told Ruby about his mother, about the way she had kept their small house in Kansas City, about the garden she grew with the stubbornness of a woman who grew things not because it was practical but because beautiful things mattered, about the way she had read to him by lamplight in the evenings, about the particular sound of her laugh. Ruby listened to all of it with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face, and when he finished she said, simply and honestly, "I would have liked to know her." "She would have liked you," Marshall said, and he meant it completely. They sat in the quiet kitchen with the Christmas snow outside and the lamp between them, and it was one of those moments that has a quality of suspension to it, like the breath before the word, and they both felt it and neither moved toward it quite yet. But the space between them had changed. Something had been said without words that was more consequential than anything they had put into language. On New Year's Eve, there was a celebration of sorts in Caldwell, a gathering at the main saloon that was attended by most of the town, and Ruby went, because she knew everyone there, and because it was expected and because she was not, she told Marshall, a woman who shut herself away from her community. She dressed in a dress Marshall had not seen before, a deep green wool that fit her properly and was not a working dress, and she put her hair up differently, with more attention, and she looked entirely different and entirely herself at the same time. She asked Marshall if he was going. He said he had not planned to. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read and then said, "You might enjoy it," in a tone that was not quite asking and not quite suggesting, and he understood that she was offering him a choice about more than just the party. He put on his good shirt, which was not as good as it once had been but was the best he had, and he rode into Caldwell with her. The saloon was full of people and noise, and the good cheer of a community that had gotten through another year, and was celebrating its own survival. Ruby moved through the room with the ease of someone who belonged to this place, shaking hands and asking about people's winter and their children and their stock. And Marshall watched her from the edges of the room with his back to the wall, the old habit of a man who had spent too long in uncertain places. But then she looked across the room at him and made the smallest possible gesture with her chin, and he pushed off from the wall and walked toward her, and she introduced him to people not as her hired man, which was what he was, but as Marshall Ford, who was managing the Brenner ranch this winter, and the distinction was not lost on him. He met the Reverend and the doctor and the school teacher, and about 14 ranchers and their wives, and a young man named Clark who was courting one of the ranchers' daughters, and who gave Marshall the careful look that young men give other men when they are trying to determine if they are competition. He met Howard Stuckey, who looked at Marshall with the flat gaze of a man reassessing a situation, and then turned smoothly away. At midnight, when the new year of 1883 was announced by someone firing a pistol into the ceiling and the general chaos of celebration, Marshall found himself standing beside Ruby, close enough to feel the warmth of her, and she looked up at him with the noise and the light all around them and said, "Happy New Year, Marshall Ford." "Happy New Year, Ruby," he said, and neither of them looked away for long enough that several people around them noticed. January was brutal. The kind of cold that the Kansas plain can produce in January is not merely cold. It is a cold with intention, a cold that tests the structural soundness of everything it encounters, and the Brenner Ranch presented it with a collection of things to test. The pig shed roof that Marshall had patched held. The water troughs needed breaking twice a day. 2 of the cattle came down with a cough that had Pete worried, and they worked together, Pete directing and Marshall doing, to isolate them and treat them with the care that Pete had accumulated over a lifetime of working stock. Ruby drove to and from town through it, every single day except the 2 days in mid-January when the temperature dropped so low and the wind came up so fierce that no living thing had any business being outside of shelter. On those 2 days, she stayed at the ranch and caught up on the accounts she kept in a small ledger that tracked every cent the cookhouse brought in and every cent the ranch required. And she sat at the kitchen table with her pencil and her ledger and her coffee, and worked with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the margin between surviving and not was a number she needed to know precisely. Marshall found her at the table on the second snow day, staring at the ledger with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not despair exactly, but a cousin of it, the look of someone doing arithmetic that is not coming out the way it needs to. He sat down across from her without asking, because he had learned that asking permission to sit at the table was something she had stopped requiring of him weeks ago. "What's the trouble?" he said. She looked up. "Nothing I can't manage," she said, which he knew by now was her first response to any difficulty regardless of its magnitude. "I know," he said patiently. "What is it?" A pause. Then she turned the ledger slightly toward him. "The cookhouse does well in summer and fall when the cattle drives are through and the town is busy. In January and February it barely breaks even. The ranch requires more than it produces at this scale. It's always been stretched tight this time of year." She tapped the ledger. "I have enough, but not much beyond enough." Marshall looked at the numbers without touching the book. "What would change it?" he asked. "More cattle, eventually. If I could expand the herd in the spring, increase production, it would change the balance." She closed the ledger. "But that requires capital I don't have." "Is there any credit available in town?" "From the bank, yes. But the banker, Mr. Coles, has made it clear that a woman running a ranch alone is not his preferred borrower." She said this with a flatness that held a great deal of compressed anger. "He has made that clear on 2 occasions." Marshall was quiet for a moment. There was the injustice of it laid out plain. A competent, hard-working woman who had built and maintained a successful business and a functional ranch, being denied access to credit because she was a woman, while men with less skill and more complacency moved freely through the systems designed for them. It made him angry in a slow, certain way, the way things that are both wrong and ordinary make you angry. "What if I went with you?" he said. She looked at him. "To the bank," he said. "Not because you need me to, but because it might change what Mr. Coles thinks he's looking at." Ruby was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through her feelings about this, the practical calculation of it against the complicated emotion of needing someone else's presence to access what she should have had access to on her own terms. "It shouldn't be necessary," she said. "No," Marshall said. "It shouldn't." Another pause. Then she said, "But it probably is." He looked at her steadily. "Tell me what you need for the herd expansion and I'll go with you whenever you want to go." The look she gave him then was long and careful and layered, and it had in it, he thought, something she had not yet put into words. "All right," she said. "When the weather clears." The weather cleared in the third week of January, and they rode into Caldwell together on a day that was cold and bright and clear, the snow from the earlier storms compressed into a hard crust that the horses' hooves broke through with each step. They went to the bank on Main Street, a respectable-looking brick building that had come to Caldwell in 1880, with the air of an institution that expected the town to prove itself worthy. Mr. Coles was a neat, careful man with rimless glasses and the particular manner of someone who had learned to package his condescension as concern. He greeted Ruby with the careful courtesy of someone who had told her no twice and wanted to manage the territory around a third no, and then he looked at Marshall with an assessment that shifted something in his calculations. Marshall said very little. He sat beside Ruby and let her do the talking, because it was her business and her ranch and her request, and he was there to change a perception, not to take over. Ruby presented her case with the precision she brought to everything: the cookhouse numbers, the ranch inventory, the specific plan for herd expansion, the projected return. It was a solid presentation, better than most men he had seen try to get credit, and Coles listened to it with his glasses catching the light. Then Coles looked at Marshall. "And you are Marshall Ford." "I manage the Brenner Ranch," Marshall said. He did not say anything else because he did not need to. His presence had already communicated what Coles needed to see, which was shameful, but the world they were operating in was the world they were operating in, and getting Ruby access to the capital she needed was more important than making a point about the injustice of it. Coles approved a loan at the end of the meeting. Ruby rode home straighter in the saddle than she had ridden into town. She did not speak about the bank for the rest of the ride, and Marshall did not push it. But when they reached the ranch and she had climbed down from the wagon and he was turning his horse toward the barn, she said, "Thank you, Marshall." He turned to look at her. "I know that shouldn't have been necessary," she said. "I know that. I'm angry about it, and I expect I'll stay angry about it, but thank you for coming." "You made the argument," he said. "I just sat in the chair." "You sat in the chair very effectively," she said, with a dry humor that had something real underneath it, and then she went into the house. February arrived, and Pete's wrist, which had been declared more complicated by the town doctor in his January visit, required another opinion. Pete made the decision to go to his sister's farm near Emporia, where there was a doctor with more experience, and he might, he said, simply stay through spring if the wrist required it. He shook Marshall's hand and then looked at him with the direct, private gaze of a man saying something between the lines. "She's had a hard time of it," Pete said, "and she's the kind of woman who won't let you see it unless you watch carefully. You watch carefully." "I know how to watch," Marshall said. "I know you do," Pete said. "That's why I'm leaving without worrying about it." He turned toward the wagon that was taking him to town. "Don't let her work herself into the ground. She does that when she gets occupied." Pete left on a gray February morning, and the ranch settled into its winter-only mode with just the two of them and the stock. There was something different about those February weeks. The removal of Pete's steady, comfortable presence had altered the atmosphere of the place in ways that were subtle but real. There were fewer buffers, fewer pieces of the daily arrangement that were simply practical and required no navigation. It was just Marshall and Ruby, the ranch, the animals, the weather, and the long evenings. The conversations deepened. In the way that things do when the pressure of proximity and honest interest and shared experience reach a certain accumulation, they began to say things they had not said before. Not because they had been keeping them back deliberately, but because some things can only be said once the groundwork of trust has been laid carefully and completely enough. One evening in the middle of February, Ruby told him about the days after Daniel and the baby died, the specific shape of those days, which she had not described to anyone, which she had carried alone because there had been no one to describe them to, and because she had been busy surviving. She told it in a quiet voice, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, and he listened to all of it without interruption, and when she finished there was a silence, and then she said, I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because you've been carrying it alone, Marshall said, and it's heavy. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright, but her face was composed, and the combination of those two things, the brightness and the composure, told him more about her than anything else she had shown him. Yes, she said simply. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and neither of them spoke, and then she turned her hand over beneath his and held it. They sat like that for a long time in the warm kitchen with the wind outside and the lamp between them, and it was the most honest moment Marshall Ford had experienced in years, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him that this was what he had been moving away from for 5 years, not grief, not bad memory, not the need for open sky, but the particular vulnerability of being held in place by something that mattered. And here he was, held in place, and it did not feel like a trap. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles briefly and carefully, and she made a small sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, and then he set her hand down and they both looked at the table for a moment. "Marshall," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need you to know," she said carefully, "that I don't do things lightly. What happened with Daniel and with my son, that kind of loss changes a person's relationship with attachment. I'm careful. I'm very careful." "I know," he said, "you should be. But I also," she stopped, started again. "I also know when something is true," she said. "And I want to tell you that whatever this is," she gestured between them with her free hand, indicating the space that had gradually and inevitably closed. "Whatever this is, it is true. For me, it is true." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who ran a ranch and a cookhouse and a set of accounts and a grief and a life, who had said yes to things when yes was hard and no to things when no cost her, who made soup with sage and read poetry in the evenings and drove 8 miles home through the worst that a Kansas winter could produce without complaint. "It's true for me too," he said. "It has been for a while." She smiled at him then, the full smile, the real one, the one that changed her face, and he thought that he would like to be the cause of that smile for as long as she would allow it. March came in cold and then slowly, grudgingly allowed the first suggestions of warmth. The days lengthened. The cattle in the winter pasture began to look toward the east, grazing with the particular yearning of animals who understood grass and its seasons. The horses grew restless. Marshall found himself doing the same work he had done in the fall, but with an entirely different quality of attention, because the ranch was not just a place he was passing through now. It was a place he was invested in, and the difference between those two relationships to a piece of land is the difference between reading a map and living in a country. He and Ruby had moved carefully into something that was acknowledged between them without yet being named. There were moments every day that were not precisely professional. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder when they stood together at the fence looking at the cattle. A look across the kitchen table that held more than a look should reasonably be expected to hold. The way they had both stopped going to their separate spaces directly after supper and had started staying in the kitchen longer, sometimes without talking at all. Just present in the same room in the comfortable way of people who have discovered that the other's company is restorative rather than draining. But they were careful. Ruby had said she was careful, and he respected that. And he was not a man who pushed at things that needed to come at their own pace. What changed things was a Sunday in mid-March when the weather came in warm, and the sky went completely blue, and the prairie smell came up through the thawed ground. That particular smell of the plains in early spring that is green and old and alive all at once. And Ruby came to find him where he was mending the gate to the winter pasture and said, "Leave that for an hour. Come and walk with me." He looked up from the gate at her face in the spring sunlight and said, "All right." They walked north from the ranch, along the creek that ran through the north edge of the property, the same creek that Stucky wanted access to, and the cottonwoods along its banks were just beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. The water ran clear and cold over a bed of flat stones. A pair of mallards lifted from a bend ahead of them and went beating north. "I want to tell you something," Ruby said as they walked along the bank. "Tell me," Marshall said. She stopped walking and turned to face him, and he stopped too, and they stood there on the creek bank in the spring warmth with the water sound behind them. "I have been afraid," she said, "of caring for someone again. After Daniel, I have been genuinely afraid of it, and I am not a woman who is afraid of many things." "I know," he said, "but I'm more afraid," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more private, "of getting to the end of this, whatever this is between us, and realizing I was so careful that I missed it entirely." She looked at him directly with the full force of those dark eyes. "I don't want to miss it." Marshall looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and tucked one of the escaped curls back from her temple in a gesture that was entirely natural and entirely deliberate, and she leaned very slightly into his hand. Just a breath of movement, just enough. "You're not going to miss it," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." She let out a breath that had clearly been held for a while, and then she stepped forward and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood there together on the creek bank in the March sunlight, in the quiet only interrupted by the sound of the water and the cottonwoods beginning to come alive, and he held her as carefully and completely as he knew how. "I have to tell you something too," he said, after a moment. "I have been moving for 5 years because I was afraid that staying anywhere meant caring about it, and caring about it meant it could be taken away. And then I came to Caldwell to get something to eat, and a woman told me to shut the door because I was letting the cold in." She laughed. He felt it against his chest, the physical fact of her laugh. "And then I came out here to your ranch," he said, "and I slept under a roof for the first time in 5 years, and something started to shift that I didn't entirely understand at the time. And then I understood it. And the thing is, you're right. Caring about something means it can be taken. But not caring is just a slower way of losing it. A man can spend his whole life outdoors in the name of protecting himself from loss, and just end up lost instead." Ruby pulled back just enough to look up at his face. "Are you trying to be poetic?" she said. "Trying and possibly failing," he admitted. "You're not failing," she said, and she lifted herself up and kissed him, there on the creek bank, with the cottonwoods and the ducks and the wide Kansas spring sky as their only witnesses, and it was the kind of kiss that does not require anything after it because it says all the things that words have been circling for months. Spring came fully into the world after that, with the particular joy of things that have been held back too long. The cattle went back to the east grazing. The horses grew sleek and cheerful. The chickens produced eggs with the enthusiasm of living creatures who had decided the world was worth contributing to. The pig shed held. General Grant bit a fence post and seemed satisfied. Pete Carver sent a letter from Emporia in early April saying that his wrist had been properly set, that he was feeling considerably better, and that his sister's farm was comfortable enough that he thought he might stay through the summer and possibly beyond. And he wished Ruby all good things, and said he expected Marshall knew what he was doing, which they both understood as the particular endorsement of a man who trusted his own judgment. Ruby hired 2 young men from town for the busiest part of the spring work, a pair of brothers named Callum and Jesse Marsh, who were 18 and 20 respectively, who worked hard and asked few questions, and were home to their parents in town each evening. They were good workers, and they left a comfortable space between themselves and the operation of the ranch that made clear they understood the situation. Stuckey came back in April with his 4th offer on the land. He rode up on a Tuesday morning when Ruby was at the cookhouse and Marshall was in the yard, and this time he got down from his horse. "Ford," he said. "Stuckey," Marshall said, "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Brenner when she's available. Tell her I'll make it worth her while to consider selling. The offer is considerably better than the last 3. "I'll tell her you came by," Marshall said, "but I can tell you her answer now if you'd like to save yourself the time." Stuckey's eyes narrowed. "And what answer is that?" "The same one she's given you 3 times," Marshall said. "This ranch belongs to her and she intends to keep it." "She's a woman running a cattle operation alone on the frontier," Stuckey said. "Surely she can see the practical limitations of that position." "She's not alone," Marshall said quietly, and she sees her position clearly. She always has." They looked at each other for a measured moment. Then Stucky mounted his horse and left, and Marshall went back to work. When he told Ruby that evening, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He's not going to stop, is he?" "Probably not immediately," Marshall said, "but he'll understand eventually that no means no." Ruby looked at him with something in her expression that was both gratitude and a kind of warm certainty. "Thank you for being here," she said. "This is where I am," Marshall said. She crossed the kitchen to him and took both his hands in hers, and he looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face. And there was that smile again. The real one, the one he had decided was one of the finest things he had ever seen. He kissed her in the kitchen, with the supper on the stove and the spring evening coming golden through the window, and it felt entirely natural and entirely right, the way things feel when they have been building toward exactly themselves. May arrived with warmth and color and the beginning of the cattle season, which meant Caldwell came alive again as it did every summer, the trails bringing herds up from the south, the town filling with the dust and noise and energy of the cattle trade. Ruby's cookhouse was full from morning to night. She hired a girl from town named Agnes, 16 and eager, to help with the busiest hours, and the cookhouse ran at a pace that Ruby managed with the efficient authority of a woman in complete command of her domain. Marshall drove the cattle that the loan had bought, 12 new head, well selected from a rancher out of the territory who had come up the trail, onto the east grazing with the careful satisfaction of a man watching an investment take root. He sat on his horse on the slight rise at the edge of the pasture and counted the cattle and thought about grass and water and time, and he was happier than he had been in years. In June, on an evening when the cookhouse had finally gone quiet and Ruby had come home, and the supper was done, and they were sitting on the porch in the warm dark with the first fireflies beginning in the grass, Marshall said, "I need to ask you something." Ruby was quiet beside him, her shoulder against his, the dark prairie spreading out in front of them. "Ask," she said. "I know you are a person who thinks carefully before she does anything," he said. "I know that what you've built here you've built on your own terms, and I have no intention of interfering with any of it. So this is not me trying to change what you have. It's me asking if you would consider letting me be more permanently part of what you have." He paused. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Ruby." The fireflies made their small lights in the dark. The prairie smell came up warm and green. She was very still beside him. "Marshall Ford," she said slowly. "Yes," he said. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Because you spent 5 years moving, and I'm a woman who requires a person to stay." "I'm certain," he said. "I'm more certain of this than I have been of anything in a long time, and if you're worried about the staying, I have already stayed. The staying has already happened. I'm not planning it in the future, I'm doing it right now." She turned her head to look at him. In the dark he could see the shape of her face, the brightness of her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since approximately October, and she laughed. And he kissed her right there on the porch in the June dark with the fireflies and the prairie and the whole enormous star-scattered Kansas sky as their witness. They were married in Caldwell in July of 1883, on a Saturday morning when the cattle drives were at their height, and the town was full, and the Reverend was available between a baptism and a funeral, which struck Marshall as an entirely appropriate set of bookends for a wedding. Ruby wore the green dress she had worn on New Year's Eve, because she was a practical woman, and a perfectly good dress did not stop being perfectly good because the occasion had changed, and she wore her hair up with a few of the escaped curls around her temples, because Marshall had once, in the kitchen, tucked one of them back from her face in a way that she had thought about more than was reasonable. He wore his good shirt, which had been replaced since the winter version with a new one that Ruby had purchased without telling him from the dry goods store, leaving it folded on his bunk one morning and walking away before he could argue about it. Pete Carver came back from Emporia for the wedding, his wrist healed and his mustache impressively maintained, and he sat in the front row of the church with the satisfied air of a man who has correctly predicted an outcome. Callum and Jesse, Marsh stood outside the door and fired their pistols into the air when the couple came out, as the local tradition required, and Agnes from the cookhouse cried in the cheerful way of a young woman who found the idea of love entirely satisfying. Howard Stuckey did not attend, which suited everyone. They had a celebration at the cookhouse in the afternoon, with the community of Caldwell coming and going through the day, and Ruby made a cake that was nothing like a wedding cake in the conventional sense, but was exactly what she wanted, which was a proper gingerbread with real dried ginger, her mother's recipe, because some things had a particular rightness to them that did not need to be justified. Marshall stood in the cookhouse he had first walked into on an October evening nearly a year ago, and watched his wife move through the celebration with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own life, and he thought about all the miles he had traveled, all the open skies and sleeping on ground, and telling himself that this was freedom, and he understood now what it actually was, which was motion without direction, and the difference between that and what he had now, which was a place and a person, was the difference between wandering and belonging. He did not miss the open sky. He had the porch and the prairie and Ruby beside him in the evenings, and that was more sky than any man needed. They went back to the ranch that evening, and the Brenner ranch, which was, without any formal discussion, becoming the Ford ranch in the sense that it belonged to both of them, though the deed remained in Ruby's name because she had earned it that way, and he had no intention of changing what she had built settled around them in the summer night. He stood in the yard and looked up at the stars, which were vast and close and entirely themselves, and Ruby came to stand beside him with her shoulder against his arm, and they stood there in the warm dark. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a simple person to be married to." "I've gathered that," Marshall said. "I have opinions about the cattle accounts, and I will always have more opinions about the cattle accounts than you will, and I intend to be right about them." "You generally are," he said, "and I work very hard, and sometimes I forget to stop, and when I forget to stop you should tell me, because I find it very difficult to tell myself." "Pete told me that," Marshall said. "Before he left in February." She turned to look at him. "Pete told you to watch out for that." "He said it diplomatically," Marshall said, "but that was the substance of it." Ruby made a sound that was exasperated and fond at once. "Pete Carver," she said. "Good man," Marshall said. She turned back to the stars. I'm not easy about the grief," she said more quietly. "Daniel and the baby, it doesn't hurt the same way it used to, but it's there, and some days it's closer than others." "I know," Marshall said. "That's true of most things worth having had." She leaned against him. "I love you," she said, in the direct, unornamented way she did everything, as though love were a fact to be stated rather than an admission to be made carefully. "I love you," he said, equally directly, and they both looked at the stars for a while. He thought about his mother's garden, which she had kept beautiful with stubborn, loving attention. He thought about all the Kansas sky he had slept under, which was fine sky. There was nothing wrong with the sky, but there was something to be said for the view from inside looking out. He thought about a bunk in a shed behind a house, and a woman who had said it had been empty long enough. She had been right about that, as she was generally right about most things. The rest of that summer moved quickly, as summers in cattle country do, full of work and weather and the noise of the trail. The cookhouse prospered. The expanded herd gained weight on the good east grazing grass. The loan from Mr. Coles, who had been more respectful in his subsequent dealings, once he understood that the Brenner ranch had acquired a permanent pair of hands, and a marriage certificate, was being paid back ahead of schedule, which Ruby tracked with the satisfaction of a woman who trusted numbers and liked watching them go the right direction. Marshall rode fence and tended stock and helped Ruby with the accounts in the evenings, though as predicted, she had more opinions about the accounts than he did, which was fine because she was more often right. He learned the specific characters of all 12 of the original cattle and all 12 of the new ones. He brokered a peace with General Grant that involved a consistent supply of carrots and a mutual understanding about personal space. He repaired the roof of the main house, which had needed it since before he arrived, and replaced 2 windows, and built a proper step up to the back door that Ruby had been managing without since the original one rotted away in 1880. She noticed the step before he finished it and came out to look at it with her hands on her hips, and then she said, "That's good work," in the tone of someone who gives compliments as assessments rather than gifts, and he understood that as high praise. In September, Ruby told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, at the table in the evening, with the lamp between them, which was the table where most of the important things in their life had been said. She told him with the particular careful directness of a woman who is managing her own heart very consciously, because she had been here before, had been expecting before, and had learned what could be taken. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him, long enough that she said, with the smallest tremor in her voice, "Marshall." "I'm here," he said immediately. "I'm right here. He stopped. He put his hand flat on the table between them and she put hers over it. "I'm very glad," he said. "I'm genuinely deeply glad, and I know what it means that you're telling me, and I know what it costs you to be hopeful about it," she exhaled. "Yes," she said. "We'll take care of you," he said. "I'll take care of you, and we'll be careful and we'll be hopeful, and whatever happens, we'll face it together." He looked at her steadily, making sure she heard all of it. "We are not alone in this." She gripped his hand. "No," she said, "we are not." The pregnancy was careful, and then it was fine, and then it was very fine. Ruby continuing to work at the cookhouse with the practical attitude of a woman who understood that her body was doing something remarkable, and also that pies needed to be made. And Marshall watching her with the particular attention of a man who had been told to watch carefully, and who did not require the instruction. He also consulted the doctor in Caldwell with a directness that surprised the doctor, asking every question he could think of about what was normal and what was not, and what he should be looking for, and what he should do if any of those things occurred. The doctor answered all of it with increasing respect, and gave him a pamphlet that had been printed in St. Louis about the management of pregnancy in frontier conditions, which Marshall read cover to cover, and then read again. Ruby found the pamphlet on the shelf above his bunk, the bunk in the shed that was now technically his dressing room rather than his sleeping quarters, since sleeping happened in the house, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him with an expression that was layered and warm. "You went to the doctor," she said. "I asked him questions," Marshall said. "Yes." She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was managing an emotion that she considered private. "Thank you," she said, and set the pamphlet back on the shelf with care. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was gentler than the previous winter, or perhaps it only felt that way because the house held 2 people now rather than 1 woman alone, and warmth accumulates with company. They had the long evenings together, and the kitchen conversations, and the particular comfort of waking beside someone who is real and present and known. Ruby read more of Daniel's poetry book, finding that it no longer hurt the way it had, that it had become something she could hold without it holding her, and she read pieces of it aloud to Marshall in the evenings, and he listened with his particular quality of full attention, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him. The baby was born in April of 1884, a fine spring morning with the cottonwoods out along the creek, and the prairie green and the whole world at its best possible version, which Marshall could not help feeling was arranged specifically for the occasion. He was the one who rode like the wind into Caldwell to bring the doctor and who sat outside the door of their bedroom in a state of controlled terror, while the doctor and Agnes, who had been summoned, attended to Ruby, and who was let in when it was over to find Ruby exhausted and composed and entirely herself, with a baby boy in her arms. A boy, red-faced and vigorous and apparently very clear on his opinions about having arrived in the world. Marshall sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and he did not have any words for what he felt, which was all right because feelings of that magnitude do not require words. He put one finger out, and the baby's hand, which was impossibly small and absolutely complete, closed around it with the decisive grip of someone who knew what they wanted to hold onto. "Daniel," Ruby said quietly. "I'd like to call him Daniel if that's all right with you." Marshall looked at her. He understood what she was doing, not living in the past, but honoring it, making space for the dead within the life of the living, which is the most honest kind of memorial. "Daniel Ford," he said. "That's a good name." She smiled at him, and the baby Daniel Ford, who had opinions, made a sound of absolute authority. The next years unfolded with the natural rhythm of a life that is genuinely lived, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with the accumulated warmth of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and continued to choose each other every day. The ranch grew. The herd expanded further. The loan paid off. A new section of east grazing fenced and put to use. Ruby's cookhouse became an institution in Caldwell, the place you went if you wanted a real meal, staffed now by Agnes, who had become genuinely skilled, and a cook named Mrs. Paulson, who had come to Caldwell with her husband and whose pie crusts were a matter of local pride. Ruby stepped back slightly from the daily operation, not abandoning it, but trusting it to run, because she had built something solid enough to stand on its own for stretches. Howard Stuckey came by one final time in 1885, and he came alone, and he tied his horse at the gate and walked up to where Marshall was working in the yard, and he stood for a moment and looked at the ranch, at the solid barn, the well-maintained fence lines, the evidence everywhere of sustained and competent labor, and then he said, "I see you're not selling." "No," Marshall said. Stuckey nodded slowly. "Offer's still there," he said without particular force, "but I can see it's not going anywhere." He paused. "She's done well," he said, and there was in his voice something that was not quite admiration but was the thing that happens to stubborn men when they are finally compelled to acknowledge reality. "You've both done well." He rode away, and he did not come back. Daniel grew into a cheerful, decisive toddler who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's unhurried watchfulness, and who had views about everything and communicated them through a combination of words and emphatic gesture. He helped feed the chickens before he could reliably walk without falling. He formed an alliance with General Grant that mystified everyone, since the mule had never previously shown any interest in the company of humans, and yet he stood at the fence of the mule's paddock every morning and let the boy pat his nose with a patience he extended to no one else. Pete Carver came back to Caldwell in the summer of 1885. His wrist healed, his sister's farm comfortably managed by her grown sons, and he wanted to know if there was still work. Ruby looked at Marshall, and Marshall looked at Ruby, and they both looked at Pete, who was holding his hat in his hands with the slightly abashed air of a man who was not entirely certain of his reception. "Your bunk's still in the barn," Ruby said. "Same $1.50 a week." Pete smiled, the large, warm smile of a man returning to something he valued. "I accept," he said. He was wonderful with Daniel, who called him Pete with an authority that delighted the old cowhand and who rode on Pete's shoulders around the yard with the conviction of someone who had identified the finest possible mode of transportation and intended to use it exclusively. The summer of 1886 brought heat and good grass, and a very good price for cattle at the railhead. The ranch was solid, the cookhouse was thriving, and in August Ruby told Marshall she was expecting again, with the same direct care as the first time, at the same kitchen table in the evening. He had not run out of gladness for that table and its announcements. This time the pregnancy went just as well, and the birth came in March of 1887, and it was a girl, small and loud, and equipped from birth with the particular expression of someone who expects the world to be interesting and is already taking notes. They named her Margaret, after Marshall's mother, and Ruby said the name out loud several times in the days after, turning it in her mouth like something good, and he loved her very deeply for that. Daniel, who was nearly 3, had opinions about his sister that were on balance positive, though he reserved the right to revise this position as circumstances warranted. The years settled into the thing that years become when you are living them fully, which is a texture rather than a sequence. The daily work, the seasons, the pleasures and difficulties specific to the place, and the time, the way a life accumulates meaning not through its exceptional moments, but through its consistent ones. The morning coffee in the kitchen while the day was still deciding what to be. The evening on the porch with the prairie spread out enormous and alive before them. The particular satisfaction of the accounts at the end of a good month. The warm weight of 2 sleeping children in a house that held them. Marshall did not miss the open sky. He had the porch, as he had predicted, and the prairie and the extraordinary sky above both, and he could lie on his back on the porch boards on a clear night and see more stars than he had ever seen from a bedroll on the ground, which he thought had something to do with the fact that everything looks different when you are seeing it from a place that is yours. In the fall of 1887, he stood at the north pasture fence on an October morning very like the October morning on which he had first ridden into Caldwell, and he leaned on the fence rail and looked out across the grass, which was going golden, and the sky, which was that particular deep blue that Kansas only achieves in October, and he thought about the man he had been 5 years ago, the man on the tired roan horse, coating of dust, no roof, no direction. Too proud of his own motion to admit that he was lost, he heard Ruby's voice behind him and turned. She was walking up from the house with Daniel running ahead of her, Daniel's small legs covering the ground with the enthusiastic inefficiency of a child who has not yet learned to conserve energy, and she had Margaret on her hip, wrapped in a blanket against the October cool, and she was talking to Daniel about something she was gesturing toward with her free hand, and her hair was doing the thing it always did, losing the battle at her temples, the curls escaping. And she was wearing an everyday dress with an everyday apron, and she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life, which had by now seen a considerable number of things worth looking at. She reached the fence and leaned on the rail beside him and handed Margaret to him, which Margaret accepted with the equanimity of a baby who trusted the transfer, and Ruby looked out across the pasture. "Cattle are looking good for this late in the season," she said. "They are," Marshall agreed. "That new line of Herefords is doing better than I expected on this grass." "I told you they would," she said. "You did," he said. They stood in the October morning with Daniel running circles around their feet, and Margaret studying the sky from the vantage point of her father's arms with the focused attention of someone gathering information about the world. And the cottonwoods along the creek had gone golden, and the fence ran out across the grass in both directions, straight and solid, every post he had set himself over 5 years of work. "Are you happy?" Ruby asked, in the direct way she had of asking things that some people approach sideways. He turned to look at her. The morning light on her face, the escaped curls, the dark eyes looking at him with the honest attention they had turned on him since the very first evening in the cookhouse. "Yes," he said simply. "Are you?" She took a moment with it, the same way she took a moment with anything that deserved one. Then she said, I am more than I thought I would be again." She paused. "After everything." "After everything," he agreed. She took his free hand, the one not holding Margaret, and held it the way she always held his hands, firmly, without affectation, the way she did everything. Daniel ran up and grabbed her other hand and demanded to be told about cows, and she launched into a patient explanation of why the Hereford was a sensible cattle breed for the southern Kansas grass, and Margaret looked at Marshall with Daniel's dark eyes in a rounder face, and made the small sound that meant she had opinions beginning to form. The October sky stretched out over all of it, enormous and blue and full of light, the kind of sky that the Kansas plain produces when it is at its finest, and Marshall Ford held his daughter and watched his wife explain cattle breeds to his son, and thought that the man on the tired roan horse 5 years ago would not have believed this was possible, which was the most interesting thing about possible things. They tend to arrive from directions you were not watching. He had come to Caldwell in October of 1882, dusty and directionless, and a woman in a cookhouse had pointed at his mud-tracked entrance and told him to sit down, and he had sat down, and everything else had proceeded from that. From a bowl of bean soup and a plate of pie and a pair of dark eyes that could see past the dust to whatever was underneath. From a spare bunk in a shed behind a house, offered without ceremony to a man who had not slept under a roof in 5 years, because the bunk had been empty long enough, and the woman who owned it was not a woman who left useful things idle when there was work to be done and a person who needed them. That was Ruby. That had always been Ruby. She saw what needed doing and she did it, whether it was mending a cookhouse or a ranch or a man who had spent 5 years in open country convincing himself that he was fine. Margaret made her opinion sound again, and Marshall shifted her in his arms, and she grabbed his coat lapel with one decisive fist and settled, satisfied. He looked out at the Kansas October, at the golden cottonwoods and the good grass and the solid fence, and the cattle grazing in the afternoon of the season, and he was entirely and unreservedly home. In the spring of 1888, they added a room onto the house, because it was time, because the 2 children needed more space, and the third one that Ruby had confirmed in February would need space too. Marshall and Pete did most of the building themselves, and Callum Marsh, who was 23 now and working for the ranch permanently, handled the framing with a skill that had developed considerably since his first summer. The new room went on the east side, where it caught the morning light, and Ruby furnished it with a care that was practical and personal at once. A good bed, a window that faced the creek, a shelf for the books that were accumulating. The third child was another boy, born in September of 1888, and they called him Thomas Tom from his first week. And he arrived with the particular character of a youngest child, which is to say he was cheerful about nearly everything, and had already determined that his siblings were his primary entertainment and source of education. Daniel took his new brother role with the gravity of someone who understood that responsibility had been conferred, and Margaret regarded Tom with the thoughtful analysis of a 1-year-old who was updating her model of the world. Ruby came home from the cookhouse one October evening, an October evening very much like the one on which all of this had begun, the sky going dark and the air carrying the first sharpness of the coming cold, to find Marshall on the porch with Tom against his chest, both of them watching Daniel and Margaret, who were engaged in some negotiation in the yard that involved a stick and General Grant's fence and several firmly stated positions. The lamp was lit in the kitchen, and the smell of the soup she had started that morning and left to cook all day came through the door, and she pulled up her wagon and climbed down and stood for a moment looking at the scene before going in to change and start the bread. "How was town?" Marshall asked. "Busy," she said. "Agnes made 3 pies and sold all 3 before noon. I think she should have her own establishment in another 2 years." "Will you let her?" Ruby smiled. "I'll help her." She looked at Tom, who was sleeping against Marshall's chest with the complete absence of self-consciousness that very small children have about sleeping. "How was he?" "Excellent," Marshall said. "He had strong opinions about his morning and communicated them thoroughly and then fell asleep about an hour ago." "Sounds like his father," Ruby said. "I don't fall asleep an hour after stating my opinions," Marshall said. "No," she agreed. "You usually wait 2 hours to be civil." She went inside and he heard her in the kitchen, and the sounds of the house with all its people in it or nearby were the sounds of everything that mattered. Tom breathed against his chest. Daniel and Margaret reached a negotiated settlement involving the stick, General Grant, and what appeared to be a count of 3. The October dark came down over the prairie, and the first stars appeared. In the kitchen, Ruby was singing something half under her breath, the way she did when she thought no one could hear her, the old Missouri song about rivers that her mother had sung, and that she had sung to Daniel when he was very small, and that she sang now to all of them in the evenings when the day was finished and the house was settling. Her voice was nothing remarkable, just her voice, real and warm and entirely hers. Marshall sat on the porch in the October dark and listened to it, and felt the weight of his sleeping son, and watched the stars come out one by one over the enormous Kansas sky. And he was a man with a roof over his head and a wife who sang in the kitchen and 3 children who were arguments against the position that the world was indifferent to what happened to you. He had ridden into Caldwell on a cold October evening 5 years and more ago with nothing but a tired horse and the kind of hollow freedom that comes from having nothing to lose. He had lost more than that along the way, he knew that now, understood it from the inside, the capacity for permanence, the ability to let something matter enough to stay. And then a woman in a cookhouse had pointed to a spare bunk and said it had been empty long enough. He had taken the bunk. He had taken the work. He had taken, in the fullest possible sense, the life that came with them. The ranch and the difficulty and the winters and the beauty of the creek in spring, and the weight of the accounts and the pleasure of soup made with sage, and the particular extraordinary everyday fact of Ruby Brenner, who was Ruby Ford now, who was singing in the kitchen. He was, as he had told her truthfully on the September afternoon she had asked, happy. The stars filled in overhead, one by one, until the sky was crowded with them in the way of October skies, clear and cold and magnificent. General Grant made a sound of general approval from his paddock. Daniel and Margaret came across the yard and up the steps, and Daniel reported on the outcome of their negotiations in considerable detail. And then they went inside for supper, and their small voices joined their mother's voice in the kitchen, and Tom slept on against Marshall's chest. He sat a little longer because the evening was fine and because he had learned, in the way that a man learns things that matter, that the finest things are worth sitting still for. Then he stood carefully, cradling Tom against his shoulder, and went inside to his family. The door closed behind him. The lamp burned in the window, visible from the road, the same warm square of yellow light that had been visible the very first evening, welcoming and constant. The smoke rose from the chimney into the October dark. The horses settled in the barn. The cattle breathed slow and warm in the winter pasture. General Grant contemplated the fence and found it acceptable. On the prairie, the wind moved through the grass the way it always had, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful, and the house stood against it, solid as anything built with real intention stands, holding everything that it was meant to hold. The spare bunk was empty no more. The restless man had rested. The careful woman had been met in her carefulness and loved in it. And the life they had made from a bowl of bean soup, and a pair of dark eyes, and a bunk in a shed was full and warm and real, turning slowly into the future with all the ordinary grace of a good thing that has been built to last.